Hello and welcome back. Today we are learning the laws of finding errors or an invalid mistake that's in the Torah whilst you're reading it, and what constitutes of a Torah which is invalid for you to use. We have to understand that for 3,300 years already, the Jewish people have not had the Torah with us, and not once have we found an error in the Torah, which means that we all universally have the same Torah. There's no many versions for the Jewish people. There's only one version of the actual written text. Believe it or not, no one argues on that. The text is the same for everybody. And what's amazing is in 1948, when many communities came together after not communicating for years, it's not like today where we have phones and communication, virtual communication. But in those days, when people were not able to see each other, somebody who lived in Germany never saw a Yemenite Jew, never saw a Jew from Iran or from Morocco. So this was an amazing opportunity for all these communities to come together, and they looked at everyone's Torah, and everyone's Torah was exactly the same. Beautiful thing. Now, if there was many versions of the Torah, if there was many different versions, and there is in all the other religions, but if Judaism was like that, then we'd have to ask a big question. Who wrote the Torah, and where's the original version? If, let's say, there's 150,000 different versions of the Torah, different translations, different letters, generally it's the same theme, but there's different letters, and there's 150,000 different versions. So who wrote the original one? So God, in his infinite wisdom, knew that in order for the Torah to be with us till today, 3,300 years later, it has to be done in a way where it's not forgotten and the text has never been changed. And there's certain things that we do to enhance and to make sure that that happens. One of them is that when a scribe is writing the Torah, he can't write it from mind. He can't write it from his mind. He needs to look at another book, another Torah, and copy. Because if he writes it from his mind, it's more likely that he'll make a mistake. What's fascinating is that the translation of the Torah many times is the same, but when you look at the Hebrew of it, there are nuances, there are differences. For instance, the word twins, which we're going to look at now, the word twins is written once in the Torah as te'umim. Te'umim is maleh, full, with an aleph. And then in another time in Genesis, it's written tumim, in Parashat Toldot. It's written tumim, without an aleph. Both mean twins. So if I was translating the Torah, I'd write twins either time. But one time it's without an aleph, and one time it's with. The time that it's written without the aleph is in Toldot, and that's in regards to Yaakov and Esav. When they were twins, and Rivka was getting told that she's going to have twins, it says, V'hinei tumim bevitna. Behold, there are twins in her womb, but without an aleph. Later on, when Yehuda is married to Tamar, and he has children with her, she has Peretz and Zarach, and there it says Te'umim with an aleph. What's the difference? And Rashi explains, because aleph represents God. Aleph is one, it goes in all directions, it represents Hashem, and a place where there's an evil presence together with a good presence, which is what happened in the pregnancy of Rivka, where she had Esav. There was a presence of good and evil. In such a place, God's presence isn't fully there, can't be fully there. But later on, when you hear the story of Peretz and Zarach, they were both twins that were righteous. And in such a place, you can add the letter Aleph. So you see that the word twins can be translated Tumim and Te'umim. Both times they're translated as twins, but they're written differently. And yet, according to all positions, according to all communities, if you open their Torah, you will see that in the first time it writes Tumim without an Aleph. Fascinating. So let's go into this secret of this chapter of Halakha of Jewish law, which is in regards to a Torah that's invalid or has a mistake. You cannot even read from it to the public. You have to immediately close the Torah and put it away. Why? Because this is one of the ways that we preserve the Torah, that it never changed for 3,300 years. 3,300 years. The text has not changed. And one of the reasons it's been preserved is because the minute it has a mistake, that Torah is immediately closed and put away. You don't even read from it. One of the keys to ensuring that the Torah will never change. So let's look at the text of Kitzur Sulchan Aruch, chapter 24. If you look inside the Torah and you find a invalid text, either because it has a mistake in it, if it's a complete mistake, the text is completely wrong, en korinbo, you cannot read from it. We need a whole new Sefer Torah to take out. What does it mean? A complete mistake in the Torah. Kagon, for instance, yeter or chasel, if it has an extra letter, or it's missing a letter. Or nitchalef, afilu ot echad, or a letter got switched over with another letter. So it could be in the same word, but the letter was put in the wrong order. And because of this change, the reading is different. Kagon kamo tumim teumim, for instance, the word tumim or teumim both mean twins, but the reading is now different. Migrashehen, migrashehem, fields, both mean the same, but the meaning is now different. They both mean the same, but they're said differently. In such a case, just one letter already is enough to grant the Sefer Torah as invalid, and it's closed and put away. Even if the meaning is the same, nevertheless, since the reading is different, that's already called a mistake. Similarly, if the mistake is in regards you can read it in the way that it's meant to be written, so you can read it well. But the text was written now in a way that the explanation changes. So it was written well, but the explanation changes. For instance, in the portion of Truma, of the building of the tabernacle, there it says, the ark was 1.5 amot wide. Im b'makom rochbo nimtza katuv rochba. If in the place where it says rochbo, it's width, instead it says rochba without a vav, it says a hey, b'hei. Afa pishi yocholim likrot et habet b'cholam. Even though you could read it bo, so both rochbo with a vav or rochba with a vav with a hey could be written bo, because if you read the bet differently, you'll get the same word. So it could be that you can read two words that are spelled differently, the same. Mikol makom, kiven shekmo sheu katuv have ta'ut shemishtaneh perush. Since the way it's written, there's a mistake in the way it can be explained, it can be understood differently. Have gamken ta'ut kamur. In such a case, it's also an absolute mistake. Avali muta'ut hu be'inyan, if the mistake is in a way she'eno if the mistake is in a way that it doesn't change, it doesn't change the way you read it and the way you explain it. For instance, in a place where you need to write avotam, their fathers, with a vav, Acha habet, after the bet. Nimtza belo vav, and it's now missing a vav because there's a mistake. Or b'hafuch, or the other way around. It was meant to have no vav, and it has a vav. V'chein im b'makom shetzarich liot malei yud shimushit. Similarly, if you have a place where there's a yud that needs to be in there to help us understand the word, kagon avotechem, for instance, where it says avotechem, your fathers, and it has a yud there as well. But the yud, whether it's missing or added, doesn't change the meaning at all, and doesn't change the way we read it. Nimtza chaser yud, or behefech. If the yud is missing or the other way around, it's added. And similarly, anything like this, then in such a case, en motziim sefer Torah acher, we do not take out another sefer Torah. And he says here, because our Torahs today are not so medikim kokach shenema she'acha yiyeh yoter kasher. We're not so exact in the way that we are writing our Torahs today, like it used to be. So, because of that, we're not perfectionists the way we used to be. So, if it's not going to change the meaning and it doesn't change the way we read it, then it's okay to be read from in the Torah, and it's valid. Aval im chasra yud shorashit. If it's missing a yud, which is the root of the word, kagon, for example, malach hagar al tir'i. Why is this for you, Hagar? Al tir'i, don't be afraid. And he wrote, ktiv tir'i. He missed out a yud in the word tir'i, and now it can seem, don't see. When you take out a yud from the word tir'i, it says, tir'i could mean see. Below yud achar taf. If you remove the yud after the taf, you now have a different meaning. Or al tira Avram, where it says, don't be afraid, Avram. And there, ktiv tara. And instead of saying tira, which means afraid, he took out the yud, which is the root of the word. And he took out the yud, and you only have taf reish aleph, which means to see. You need to bring out another sefer Torah that's now invalid to be used. So this is an example of how strict we would be in terms of a Torah that's kosher. Even if it's one letter, it's still enough to make this Torah not usable. It needs to be put away. Let's go to number 2. Nimtza teva achat chaluka. If you find one letter or word which is split, ad sheneret keshtayim, which now looks like 2, or shenitkarvu shtei tevot, or 2 words came very close together. V'nerot ka'achad. We're talking about words here, not letters. So you have one letter which is split, and it now looks like 2. One word which is split, and it now looks like 2 words. Or 2 words that come too close together, and they look like one word. Or shenimtza teva yetera. Or in a case where you have an extra word, whether it's a strange word, where it doesn't belong there at all, whether it was written twice, or if there's a change in the formation of the paragraphs of the Torah. Some paragraphs end the sentence, and there's a space from the end of the paragraph till the next paragraph. And some, that's called patuach, paragraph patucha, where it's open till the end of the column. And there's some paragraphs which end, there's a big space, and it's stuma, which means that a new word starts on the same line. The paragraph starts on the same line. So the strict rules of which paragraph needs to be open completely and which paragraph needs to be closed. So in a case where the paragraph is open instead of being closed, or closed instead of being open, or there's a break in a paragraph in a place where it doesn't need a break. Or in a place where there needs to be a break, a paragraph ending, and there isn't. In all these cases, the Torah is invalid, and you need to immediately take out the Torah and exchange it. Number 3, nimtza shenidbak ot leot. If you find out that one letter is, before we were talking about words, now we're talking about letters. If you find that one letter is stuck to another letter, if you see that the letter was stuck after it was written, so it appears that the letters were stuck together long after it was written. Maybe it got smudged and it looks like the letters are now stuck to each other. Kasher, it's valid. Kol shelo nishtalu tzurot haotiyot, as long as the letter doesn't change its formation. If it touches one letter to another, if you could tell that it happened after it was written, it's kosher, as long as the letters don't change the way they appear to be. They don't change the way they look. But if it seems and it appears to be that they got stuck at the time that it was written, so at the time that this halakha, at the time that this Torah was written, as yesh chiluk, then there is a difference in such a case. So whilst it was written, you could tell that these letters were actually connected by mistake. Then we have to see. If it stuck together before the letter finished, which means kagon nun pshuta, you have a long nun, a final nun, a long nun, shenidbeka be'emtza'ita beregel taf. The middle of the nun got stuck to the foot of a taf, ukadome, and anything like that is pasul, it's invalid. Ella, in the weekday, you can always scratch it a bit to separate the letters from each other. On Shabbat you can't, and you'll have to put it away. But if the letters stuck together at the end of the letter, so if, let's say, you have a nun, but not a nun sofit, not an ender nun, a regular nun, and that nun at the bottom of it connected to the taf, then in such a case, you do not have to separate the Torah, you don't have to remove the Torah, and it's kosher. That's what it says here. If it stuck, the nun stuck to the previous letter at the end of the letter, not in the middle of the letter, yesh lachshir, we can validate that, at least for now, and we do not need to bring out another whole Torah for our service. Nimtza, number 4. Nimtza ot shefsid tzurato. If you find a letter that has lost its shape, ben shehaya mitchilat haktiva, whether this happened right at the beginning when they started writing this, ben shena'asa achar kach al yedei nekev pasul, or whether this happens because there's a hole in the scroll, and now it looks like that the letter is lost its shape. In such a case, pasul, it's invalid. If you find that the hole, so in a case where it's at the beginning, but if you find a hole in the middle of the letter, or mechutz laot, or on the outskirts of the letter, but the letter stays and remains in its shape, but it does not have, because of the hole, it doesn't have parchment around the letter, and you could tell that the hole was made after it was written. Kasher, it's valid. Because at the time of writing it was surrounded with a parchment, and only now it lost a bit of a hole in the parchment around the hole, but you could see that the letter was always there, and you still could see that the letter's there, then it's still valid. You have to understand that the validation of a Torah mainly is about the time that it was written. Who was the person that wrote it? And how was it written at the time that it was written? That's what really validates the Torah. If the ink skipped, it wasn't that there was a hole in a letter, but that you could see that part of the letter was written and then it skips a bit, there's a crack, and then it continues to write the rest of the letter. But it's not, the problem here is that it's not dark enough. So you could see a line, but just the darkness of the letter isn't dark enough from the ink. The ink didn't fully blend into the parchment. It's invalid and it cannot be used. Number 5, im yesh safek be'eze ot, if there is an uncertainty in a letter, shema en tzurato alea, maybe it doesn't have the right shape, marim letinok, we show it to a child, she'eno lo chacham velo tipesh, to a child that doesn't need to be a genius kid, and it doesn't need to be a kid that cannot read. Medium. Im koreh karaui kishera, if the child can read, and he'll tell you, yes, that letter is a letter shin, that letter is a letter nun, that's a letter aleph. He could see it properly, or he could see the words properly, kishera, it's valid. Vim lav pesula, if he can't read the word, then it's invalid. Ve'im hatinokot mechalkin, if there's a number of kids, one kid says, yes, that's the word it is, another kid cannot read it, holchim acharov, we go after the majority children that's there that say they can read it or not read it. If most say they can read it, it's valid. If most kids say they can't, it's invalid. V'dafka kshanu mesupakim mo'el hatinok, this is only good in a case where we're uncertain whether the text is good enough. Then the child helps. Because then he's just helping me discover the uncertainty that it was always okay. But if we know for sure that the letter is not good, like we said, if there's a hole directly in the letter all the way through, or the letter is connected in the middle of it, then that's a clear invalidation of the letter. So it doesn't help if you bring a child to help you tell you if that letter, if he can read it or not. But in a case where the child cannot see, or that in a case where you're uncertain, you bring it to the child and he can see clearly it's not kosher, he's confused, then the Torah is not kosher. But if we see that the letter is not written in its right way, if there's a crack in the yud of the aleph, so if you notice an aleph is made of a vav, a yud on top and a yud underneath. So if, let's say, one of the yuds, the hands of the aleph, is broken, or the hand of an ayin is broken, or the hand of a shin, one of the parts of the shin is broken, v'raglei hataf, and similarly the foot of a taf is broken, ukadome pasul, the letters are invalid and the Torah is invalid. Afa pisha to not koreoto, even though a child can read it, kivan she'enenu ro'od she'enaot ketikna, since our eyes see that it's not good, and you can't use a child in such a case. Number 6, we are on the last one for today. When we show this child the letters, we don't need to cover the letters after so that he's not confused, so it's more clear for him. The custom is to cover the letters beforehand so he could see exactly where he needs to read. If there's a crack if there's a hole, there's a hole in the middle of a letter, and you could see part of the letter underneath and the other part of the letter above. V'anu mesupakim, and we are uncertain. Im yesh ba'ot ad hanekev kashu, if in the letter until the hole is already enough. Let's say there's a vav and it has a hole in the middle. Now, on top of the hole, does that letter make a yud or does it make a vav? If that letter just on top of the hole makes a yud, then the Torah is not valid and has to be put away. But let's say the hole goes through most of the vav, and it's only towards the bottom that there's the hole. So it could be a yud, it could be a vav. We're not sure. We bring a child and he'll look at it and he'll tell us. In such a case, then you can use a child. That's the case of uncertainty of a hole. What we would do is we'd cover we'd cover the part that's underneath the hole. Because we know that the child, when he sees the mark underneath the hole and the mark above the hole, he'll add them together and say it's just a vav. And really you can't combine those two because the hole separates the letters. So we need to see how the letter looks above the hole and what does the child see. If the child sees a yud when it needs to be a vav, it's invalid. If the child sees a vav when it needs to be a vav, it's still valid. Similarly, if not there was a hole, but the ink skipped its place in part of the letter, so there's a crack in the ink. But there is some kind of mark. You need to cover the lower part above where there's a gap, so that the child does not combine these together. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.